we're going to go over Chapter 11, Slavery Expands South and West, 1830 to 1850. This one, the sections that we're going to cover, the topics: planters expand the slave system, slave society and culture, planters tighten control, Democrats face political and economic crisis, and the national government looks to the West. All right, let's jump right into it. Planters expand the slave system. A plantation society develops in the South. So territorial expansion and growing profits from cotton, rice, and sugar cultivation increased conspicuous consumption among Southern planters after the 1830s. Planter society really depended on slave productivity, and planters relied on harsh methods of discipline to keep productivity high. Plantation mistresses, the wives of plantation owners, they had a lot of managerial responsibilities, including oversight of the slaves' living conditions. And the benefits of slavery for plantation mistresses included a higher standard of living and relief from those most strenuous domestic tasks. They had slaves that could do them for them now. But that patriarchal system in which men are the head of gave men more power in general, forcing wives to ignore, for example, the sexual relations that their husbands engaged in with female slaves. Wealthy planters owning 50 or more slaves did not constitute the majority of Southern slaveholders. Far more slaveholders owned only 3 to 6 slaves. However, wealthy planters held the power in Southern society and politics. So they don't, not the elite, not the majority, right? They're the minority, these really, really wealthy planters, but they're going to hold all the power in society and in politics. What about urban life in the slave South, those major cities? Slave owners, they don't invest in industry or technology, and there's only a few factories that existed in the South, and they were not enough to reshape the region's economy. We are heavy agriculture in the South. Southern urban development and Southern access to cash currency also lagged behind. Some free blacks were drawn to Southern cities for job possibilities, but white Southerners viewed cities with suspicion because they served as escape hatches for runaway slaves. Planters depended on river systems to ship their goods, and most small Southern farmers only traded locally. For both these reasons, transportation in the South was generally underdeveloped. We're going to look at some slave plantations and where they're highly concentrated. You'll notice they're highly concentrated on the rivers, and we'll look at that in just a minute. Technological advances in agriculture were not implemented in the South because planters relied instead on manual labor. Why do I need to invest in this plow that's going to cost me $50 when I just have a slave that can do all the work that can do? So by 1850, slave owners in the South were outnumbered by non-slaveholding whites, and most slaves lived on large plantations. The end of the international slave trade in the early 1800s and the desire for increased productivity combined to make slaves more valuable, and owners were forced to treat their slaves better to ensure that they were physically able to perform the work, and also that female slaves were physically able to carry children because they're going to rely on natural production, right? Slaves giving birth to slaves, and they need to be a little bit healthy in order to go full term in their pregnancy and to have healthy babies that will grow into slaves. There were still limits to planters' treatment of slaves, as seen in slaves' diets and health care and living conditions in general. Just because they're being nicer and trying to make sure that they're physically fit doesn't mean that they're going to treat them necessarily better. So keep that in mind. Yes, they're going to make sure that they can survive day to day, but they're not going to live these lavish lives, as we all know. Westward expansion, it really impacted whites and blacks, and both endured harsher conditions than they were used to. However, for black slaves, moving west included the additional burden of being torn from their families. The expansion of slavery meant a boom in slave markets. So I want you to look here. So this is the slave population in orange up here. This is 1820, 1 dot equals 200 slaves, right? So you can see where it's really concentrated in some areas, especially here on the coast, right? And then slave population, you can see it really increased over the next 40 years because we are expanding westward, right? Also look at it in terms of cotton. 1 dot equals 1,000 bales, 1820s, so, right? Not really as heavily concentrated slaves, right? Kind of some sparse areas, sparse cotton, but as we start to extend cotton production, you'll notice it coincides with the expansion of slavery to the west as well. They go hand in hand. That's what the book is trying to point out. The expansion of the slave population westward goes hand in hand with the expansion of cotton production. And slaves are going to fuel the Southern economy. The American economy, you can argue, was built on the backs of slaves, literally and figuratively. The North as well as the South became dependent on slave labor, which fueled the cotton industry and increased the important part of the national economy. Why? Because the North buys cotton from the South, turns it into clothing, into other textiles, and sells it back to the South, and also overseas. Skilled slaves also added to the Southern economy, but their relative independence, even as limited as it was, made them suspect to whites. Domestic slaves led physically demanding lives and held many jobs within the household. Field hands also had physically demanding jobs, but field labor brought together a large number of slaves who forged bonds. Field laborers worked either by task or in the gang system. The task system is kind of like having a to-do list that you would check off every day, and once you have finished all of your tasks on that list, you were allowed some free time. Maybe grow your garden, or maybe cook, mend your clothes, that kind of thing before dark. Here is a plantation. This is an artist rendering plantation slaves at work, and I just want you to notice, obviously very dark, right? Dark depiction of the slaves, but look at the children. These young children don't have a whole lot of clothing. This is more than likely, I'm going to assume it's a boy, but it could be a girl, but just in a shirt when they're really, really little. You'll notice they're both helping in some way. Notice this young man in his torn and tattered clothing. It's probably, hopefully soon to the time of year when he's going to get a new set of clothes, because these are about worn out. And then you'll notice the man here. He's probably, these are picking the cotton, and he's probably somehow cultivating the cotton. Slaves are going to develop this it's a type of culture. It's called syncretic culture, and it's a blend of African and North American cultures that help them maintain ties to African roots, but also helps build these social bonds. African Americans applied this blending of cultures to religious worship as well. Female slaves adopted various aspects of Christianity as means of protection, including baptism for babies and the sanctification of marriages. Slaves used natural medicines to provide health care within their communities. So kind of these traditional African views and traditional African beliefs and culture, they bring that with them, and we can still, even today, there's a lot of African traditions that are carried out today that kind of came through over and then just eventually trickled down through African American culture. Slaves, we're going to see them resisting and just all out rebelling. So they employed both very subtle and overt types of resistance to assert their identities. So kind of some subtle forms of resistance would be breaking tools, or maybe pretending to be sick one day, or hurting an animal that they're supposed to be working with so that they don't have to work that day. Some more not so subtle could be burning of a barn or burning of a crop. And then just all out types of rebellion would be like overt, would be carrying on a full-fledged rebellion. Slaves, they would break tools, they would destroy crops, they would damage household goods, or they would run away as a form of resistance. In 1831, Nat Turner, he was a slave and a self-styled preacher. He organized a rebellion in which he and his followers liberated more than 50 slaves. They ended up killing 57 whites, though. Turner and 55 other blacks were eventually executed, and white mobs attacked more than 200 African Americans who had no connection to the uprising. They're setting an example. This is what happens to you and everyone else that's associated with you, just because of their skin color. Turner's rebellion served to instill fear in white owners and inspired anxiety among slaves, who saw the rebels' executions as evidence of how far white Southerners would go to protect this institution of slavery. A more successful slave mutiny occurred aboard the Spanish slave ship called the Amistad in 1839. There's actually a book written about it. It's called Black Mutiny. It's written by a former PJC alum. His name is Bill Owens, and you've probably heard of the famous director, Steven Spielberg, turned Black Mutiny, the book, into a movie. It's a 3-hour movie called The Amistad. I think you can watch it on YouTube maybe now. But this slave ship in 1839, so these rebels, they're captured and imprisoned by the U.S. Navy when they, kind of overthrow and take over the ship. However, international pressure led to a court case in which John Q. Adams, right, former president, defended the right of Africans to their freedom. And eventually the Supreme Court ruled to free the rebels, and that really shocked white Southerners. The reason that they were freed is because there was not supposed to be international slave trade going on. and there was evidence of international slave trade happening. So that's how there's more to it, obviously a lot more to the story. That's kind of how they end up being freed. Following Turner's rebellion, there was a special committee, and it met in Virginia to discuss the crisis of that rebellion. That was the one where 57 whites were killed. And then in retaliation, Nat Turner, his followers, and 200 innocent African Americans were killed. So the delegates from the western end of the state in Virginia, they favored gradual emancipation and African colonization to avoid future massacres, but Eastern delegates thought this would encourage more rebellions. So pro-slavery advocates like Professor Thomas Dew, he's from the College of William and Mary, the president of that college, he argued that slavery benefited whites and blacks. And the Virginia legislature rejected calls for gradual emancipation and instead imposed new restrictions on all blacks. From the 1820s to the 1840s, legislators throughout the South passed strict codes that further limited the already restricted rights of slaves. Free blacks in the South were also subject to harsh new codes designed to regulate their lives. These regulations increased tensions between wealthy planters and poorer whites, since poorer whites were often responsible for the enforcement of such laws, while wealthier whites benefited from their imposition. While yeoman farmers, landowners without slaves, were tied to the slave system in some way, they recognized that their economic interests often conflicted with those of planters, and they used their newly acquired suffrage to voice their concern. Some yeoman farmers attempted to decrease planters' authority and control in the South, but their ability to do so was limited by the economic importance of cotton. Those farmers and their families built up their own communities, but some moved to western frontiers in hopes of rising through the South class hierarchy. Unpropertied whites, those that didn't own property, included recent immigrants, resented planters for their dominance and competed with enslaved and free blacks for jobs. Some poor whites established their own communities, and planters sometimes organized mutual aid societies to assist the more respectable among the poor during hard times. Other poor whites lived more on the margin, and while their friendship with poor blacks and their use of violence were of concern to planters, poor whites did not significantly challenge planter control. Members of the South's middle class often attempted to emulate Northerners in their social and business lives. Still, middle-class Southerners benefited from slavery indirectly, as the profits from bound labor enabled planters to purchase goods and services from middle-class businessmen. So planters are going to try to unify Southern whites, right? They're going to unify all these Southern whites, the middle class, the lower class, and try to unify them against blacks. And anti-slavery views in Europe, Central America, South America, and Northern United States, it really presented a challenge to Southern planters, those wealthy elites. In order to protect slavery, planters attempted to build stronger alliances with their white Southerners, whether by exerting political control or by offering various forms of assistance to those poor whites. Planters also relied on their influence and assistance in family relationships and religious communities to shore up these relationships. Planters played on ideas of white supremacy and on white Southerners' fear of attacks by blacks to maintain white solidarity. Y'all, it is the rich white people, the very, very few white people who promote this idea of white supremacy that is still reigning true in the South today. Right, in these little pockets, we still have this white supremacy, and it's all because the rich white people instilled it. So keep that in mind. The rich, white, wealthy planters created this racist Southern culture that we have. Let's talk about the battle for Texas. Most of you that grew up in Texas, you already know this story, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. But in 1821, Mexicans overthrew Spain and they claimed Texas as part of the new Republic of Mexico. But Comanche raids made that region very unstable. In hoping to create a buffer zone against the Comanches, the Mexican government offered land grants to U.S. settlers. However, most of the settlers stayed out of Comanche's reach, and they maintained this really strong tie to the United States. And white settlers, they don't assimilate like they're supposed to. In order to move into Mexico, coming in as an immigrant into Texas, you're required to do three things. You got to speak the language, which is Spanish. You got to convert to the religion, which is Catholicism. And you can't own slaves because Mexico had outlawed slavery. The white settlers in Texas don't do any of those. And by 1835, they're going to end up outnumbering the Mexicans living in Texas 27,000 plus 3,000 slaves to 3,000 Mexicans. U.S. settlers proclaimed eastern Texas's independence on March 2, 1836, but General Santa Anna, the new president of Mexico, moved quickly to quash the rebellion, and on March 6, 1836, Santa Anna's troops killed all 250 rebels defending the Alamo in San Antonio. Dramatized accounts of the Battle of the Alamo garnered U.S. assistance and support for the rebels. Armed U.S. volunteers helped achieve a critical victory against Mexico in April. The Mexican government did not try to reclaim lost lands in East Texas, but it also refused to recognize Texan independence, which limited the ability of the United States to annex Texas without inviting a military response from Mexico. Slavery also made the annexation of Texas difficult. Congress passed a gag rule to limit debate on slavery, but Northerners still sent petitions to the House of Representatives opposing the annexation of Texas. Don't worry, it's going to come back. We're going to have this issue with Texas later on. So we're going to also, at the same time, we are trying to remove Indians from their lands, and Indians are going to resist that removal. And federal attempts to enforce the Indian Removal Act resulted in the Second Seminole War, in which a portion of the Seminole Nation of Florida, aided by runaway slaves, fought with U.S. troops. The war ended after 7 years when the U.S. Army captured the leader of the Seminole resistance. Only then did the rest of the Seminoles agree to move into Indian Territory. They actually promised, like, if you surrender, we'll stop the war, but they end up capturing him and they don't let him go. Cherokees attempted to resist removal by Americanizing, and tribal leaders sued the state of Georgia when it sought to further restrict the Cherokees' rights. The Supreme Court rulings in the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia 1831 and Worcester versus Georgia in 1832 did not grant the tribe full sovereignty, but the court did rule that Georgia could not impose state laws on the Cherokee. President Jackson still argued for the removal of the Cherokees, a popular position among Southern whites who wanted Cherokee land, and some Northern Protestant groups campaigned on the Cherokees' behalf. Without sanction from the rest of the tribe, a small group of Cherokee men signed the Treaty of New Echota with the United States in 1836, and Cherokee leaders denounced the treaty under which the Cherokee would exchange their lands in the Southeast for a third as much land in Indian Territory and $68 million, but Congress approved the treaty anyway, although it did not go before the tribal leaders. And so that's what the Cherokee group is arguing. Like, you tricked a couple of Cherokee guys or Cherokee men into signing this, and the rest of us, like, they had no authority to be signing that treaty. But we're going to uphold that treaty anyways, because that's what the U.S. government did back then. In May of 1838, the U.S. Army forcibly removed 15,000 Cherokees from their home, eventually marching them 1,000 miles west to Indian Territory. Many Cherokees died along the Trail of Tears. After the Trail of Tears, the Seneca Indians pursued legal means to petition their removal from western New York, and with the aid of Quaker allies, the Senecas' petition to Congress was successful, and they were able to remain on 2 of their 4 reservations. So these are ceded lands. I say that sarcastically because they weren't given up willingly in the dark green here. See the Cherokee here being forced to move to this Indian reservation in Oklahoma, Kansas, that area. So all the way even out here from New York, this is the Seneca tribe, who they're going to be able to stay on some of their land, but we can see here the Iroquois are leaving, the Miami, the Ottawa, Winnebago, Fox, the Sauk, Potawatomi, all those are being forced off of their lands. And what you'll notice is they're forced onto even smaller lands, right? So all of these guys, they were like really spread out, not competing too much with each other, but now they have this little bits of land that they've got to compete with each other on. Not to mention, we all know that there's like nothing good in that land. All right, let's talk about Van Buren. So Jackson's vice president, Martin Van Buren, ran as the Democratic candidate in 1836, and the Whig Party proved to have 2 disparate factions to defeat him. While Van Buren won by only a small margin in the popular vote, he held a strong majority in the Electoral College. British investment in the cotton industry in the northern states led to inflation in the mid-1830s, and tightening credit in Great Britain led to British investors calling in their loans, which resulted in the economic crisis in an economic crisis, bankruptcies and banks failing in the South. The Panic of 1837 began in the South, but moved quickly through the rest of the nation. In the South, cotton prices fell, land values declined, and cotton communities on the southern frontier collapsed. Brokers, merchants, and shippers in the North were devastated by the loss of cotton trade, and northern banks were hit by unpaid debts incurred for canals and other internal improvements. The Depression continued through the rest of the decade, and Van Buren's apparent apathy brought heavy criticisms. Many Americans blamed Jackson's war on the BUS, the Bank of the United States, for precipitating the panic. So, the Whigs are going to nominate William Henry Harrison in the 1840 presidential election, and they selected John Tyler as his running mate. The Whigs hoped that Tyler's position on nullification would attract Southern voters, even though he had been a Democrat. The Whigs presented themselves to women, many of whom had become more active in public affairs, as the moral party, and told women to encourage the men in their lives to vote for Harrison. The Whigs' joy over Harrison's victory in the election was short-lived, as he died only a month after his inauguration. Tyler's Southern sentiments and Democratic leanings frustrated congressional Whigs and allowed the Democratic Party to regroup before the next election. In the run-up to the 1844 presidential election, Democrats seized on the popular idea of the United States expanding outside of its current borders and ending its joint occupation of the Oregon Country with Great Britain. The Democratic candidate, James K. Polk, centered his campaign on expansion, specifically on the annexation of Texas and the reoccupation of Oregon, using his strategy to beat the Whig candidate Henry Clay, who was uncommitted on the Texas issue. The anti-slavery and anti-annexation Liberty Party won enough votes in New York State to give Polk the victory. The annexation of Texas occurred a month before Polk's inauguration and a day after Florida became a state. Expansion based on a vision of manifest destiny became the theme of Polk's administration. Polk first turned his attention to Oregon. Until the 1840s, most Americans living there resided south of the Columbia River. More Americans began moving to Oregon in 1842 and settling north of the Columbia. British attempts to deter American settlement rallied the president and the nation and resulted in a treaty that extended the boundary line between British Canada and the United States, the 49th parallel, all the way to the Pacific. Population increases in the west due to white migrations and the influx of eastern tribes transformed among Indian tribes. The Comanches in Texas allied with former foes and established trading relationships with the United States and Mexico and with other tribes, expanding Comanche influence in Texas. Post-independence Mexico was unable to continue Spanish authorities' policy of giving gifts to the Comanche to maintain peace, so Comanche warriors attacked the Tejano settlements. However, the Comanches also cultivated commercial relations with New Mexico residents, undermining the hold of Mexican authorities on the region. There is a disagreement over Texas's boundary, and that led to both Mexico and the United States sending troops into the disputed area. Fighting between U.S. and Mexican troops in May of 1846 resulted in Polk declaring war with Mexico, although he sent his troops across the border. That doesn't matter. Despite the objections of many Whigs in Congress, most Americans were pro-expansion and supported the war, but opponents of slavery rejected it. U.S. troops achieved victories in California and Mexico and along the Gulf Coast. So those of you that are from Texas, you know this already. I'm going to show you this map. Right? So Texas and Texan residents were saying, no, when we won our independence and after the war with Mexico, our southern border is the Rio Grande. It's all the way down here. And Mexico came back and they were telling U.S. like, no, if you want to annex Texas, that's cool, but her border is at the Nueces River up here. So all this area, that's the disputed area. So what Polk does is he sends troops into this disputed area over the border. Of course it's going to create conflict and war. So we're going to go to war with Mexico. And it's over this area, right? This disputed area. And at the end of the war, spoiler alert, we're going to inherit all of this area from Mexico. So let's talk about that really quickly. So poorly equipped soldiers and political divisions in Mexico, it left the Mexicans vulnerable on the battlefield. Santa Anna, newly restored to the presidency, he refused to admit defeat despite significant U.S. victories, and he attacked General Zachary Taylor's troops. So Polk sent General Winfield Scott and his troops to march to Mexico City, and the Mexican government ousted Santa Anna and pursued peace with the United States. And in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States gave Mexico $15 million in exchange for control of Texas, north and east of the Rio Grande, And we also got California and the New Mexico Territory. So we'll go back and look at this again. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, we get all of this area, right? All of this disputed area, and then we also get that which we had claimed was ours all the way south to the Rio Grande, or the Rio Grande. So what are we going to do with all this new territory, right? We had the Missouri Compromise. Let's go back, sorry, one more time. The Missouri Compromise said you can't have any, like all this area to the south of this 3630, you can't have slaves in that area. So now that we have all of this, what are we going to do? Keep in mind, Mexico abolished slavery. You're not supposed to have any slaves. Although Texas settlers, they did bring slaves with them. You're not supposed to have any slaves in this area. So the question becomes, well, what are we going to do? The debate over slavery's expansion into these newly acquired areas, it really divided the nation. And in 1846, the Wilmot Proviso, that would have outlawed slavery in any territory gained from Mexico. It's defeated in the Senate by Southerners and pro-slavery Northern Democrats. And the issue of slavery's expansion was still unresolved as the 1848 election approached. Democratic candidate Lewis Cass, an expansionist, he argued that settlers within each territory should decide whether slavery should be allowed there or not. Popular sovereignty, let the people vote. In an attempt to retain national support, the Whigs nominated General Taylor, a Southern slaveholder, for president, and Millard Fillmore, a Northerner who had opposed the annexation of Texas, for vice president. And what they're trying to do, well, the Liberty Party leaders, they're hoping to expand their support, and they reinvented themselves as the Free Soil Party and argued for the exclusion of slavery from the Western territories. They chose former President Martin Van Buren as their nominee. Free Soilers made slavery an unavoidable issue in the election, and Van Buren's victory in New York State took enough votes from Cass to give Taylor the presidency, putting a Southern slaveholder in the White House. And that is where we are going to end Chapter 11. But don't worry, it gets even more heated and more debate's going to happen in Chapter 12 as we're talking about imperial ambitions and sectional crisis.